How's it going, everybody? I'm going to be doing a video here about Dan, the tribe of Dan. Some of y'all may be familiar with me and this topic. If so, you might be bored with it, and that's fine. I'm trying to consolidate this into this video, and I would really appreciate if you would share this with as many people as you can. Y'all know I don't care about fame. I got a small channel. I don't care if it ever gets big. I don't ask people for money. I don't ask you to like and subscribe ever, and I never will. But I am asking that you share this because I'm trying to fit a lot of information into a small period of time here, and I really feel it's important. I used to be, for lack of a better way of putting it, I used to be a Danite, and God rescued me from it. So it is possible to come out of it. This isn't anything to terrify anybody terminally. But it is frightening when you realize what it's pointing the finger to. Who is Dan and why are they missing? That's what I'm going to call this one. Now, Revelation chapter 7, the tribe of Dan is not listed in the roll call of the tribes of Israel, the Israel of God. And so I want to look at, you get a lot of people asking questions about why is that? And you usually get answers that go back to, well, in the Old Testament, so-and-so and so-and-so. And that's good. I'm not saying it's not good because that is where you should start. But it's almost like most people that I've seen talk about it stop right there. And they don't carry it any further than that. They don't make the connection that what has been shall be. The thing that has been shall be. There's nothing new under the sun. The things in the Old Testament serve as examples for us today. That's in 1 Corinthians 10. So we should be able to look at the Old Testament Dan, that's true, but we should also be able to figure out who Dan is now. Because ultimately, Dan in Revelation 7, that's the New Testament, they're not there. That's what we're trying to figure out. And I've never seen anybody put that puzzle together as far as old and new together. You see what I'm saying? So we're going to start at the beginning. And the beginning of Dan is Genesis chapter 30. Genesis chapter 30, verses 1 through 6. Dan is first born in chapter 30 of Genesis. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, give me children or else I die. Right out of the gate, that right there is a huge clue. She's impatient for children. Well, what is it? The things in the Old Testament serve as examples for the what today? Children and childbirth in the New Testament are allegories for the return of Jesus Christ. You can get that by cross-referencing John chapter 16, verse 21, where he talks about a woman in travail having sorrow. You cross-reference that with Matthew 24, verse 8, the beginning of sorrows. That's dealing with the things that are going to happen leading up to what? His return. And then 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 3 talks about a woman in travail, those people who say peace and safety. Sudden destruction comes. Guess who's bringing that destruction to them? That's Jesus' return. So children and childbirth are allegory for the return of Jesus. Well, in the Old Testament, Dan here is birthed out of, the birth of Dan is rooted right out of the gate. Give me children or else I die. So who is it today that is impatient for children, as in the return of Jesus? It's the people who tell us that he's coming back before the Bible actually says he is. So that's a clue right there. If you keep reading, and Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in God's stead? Who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And she said, behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her. She shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. And she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife. So Jacob is just getting another wife. He's picked up an extra wife here, and this woman ends up having Dan. So the birth of Dan is rooted in impatience for children, which I've already dealt with, return of Christ, who's impatient for that, and an extra wife. Now, the people who tell us that Jesus is coming back before the Bible actually says he is, through their doctrine, they have created what? They create a pre-trib Gentile bride. And even though they deny it, the doctrine itself forces a situation where Jesus is given a second wife in the Great Tribulation that's Jewish. They don't call it that, but nevertheless, that's what their doctrine creates. So you've got two matches here with a modern doctrinal system as far as Dan is concerned. Now, if you go to, let's see, I think I got this marked here. This is Joshua. Joshua chapter 19. Verse 47, and the coasts of the children of Dan went out too little for them. Therefore the children of Dan went up to fight against Lashem. So they didn't like what they got. The verses before verse 47 tell you the allotment they were given. They didn't like it. So they went somewhere else. They went and got more land. So they reject their allotment in Israel. Who is it today doctrinally that says we're not Israel, we're the church? They reject their allotment in Israel. And what did they do? This land they went and conquered. Well, if you go to Judges chapter 18, you find out, let's see, verse number 10. This is the description of the land. When you go, you shall come into a people secure, into a large land. For God hath given it into your hands, a place where there is no want of anything that is in the earth. It's a land of plenty. It's a large land of plenty. And here's the kicker. If you read verse 7 and verse 28 of this, you find out that immigrants live here. So it's a large land of plenty inhabited by immigrants. Verse 7, then the 5 men departed, and those are Danites, and came to Laish, which is the same as Lashem from Joshua 19, verse 47, and saw the people that were therein, how they dwelt careless after the manner of the Zidonians. That's not a throwaway detail. But keep reading. Quiet and secure, and there was no magistrate in the land that might put them to shame in anything, and they were far from the Zidonians. Why would it matter? Why would it matter if these people were living far from the Zidonians and they lived as the manner of the Zidonians? Because that's where they're from. They're immigrants. It's telling you that without telling you that. But verse 28 really drives this point home, because this is when Dan actually attacks to kill these people and take this land over. And there was no deliverer. Why? Because it was far from Zidon. So the people at Zidon would be likely to help them, right? Why? They're immigrants. Large land of plenty inhabited by immigrants. Dan rejected their allotment in Israel. Who rejects their allotment in Israel today? Through their doctrine, spiritually speaking. We're not Israel, we're the church. What country is that doctrinal system the most successful in? Where is it took root in the most? A large land of plenty inhabited by immigrants. And here's the kicker, Zidonian, that's where Jezebel was from. Feminism is Jezebel's spirit. America is dominated by what? Feminism. Almost every aspect of life. So are you starting to kind of pick up on this? And like I said, if you're not new to this, or if this isn't new to you, that's fine. And there's another interesting aspect of this. You know, everybody looks at the church of Laodicea in Revelation chapter 3, when it talks about being lukewarm and being vomited out. And it talks about how what? Have need, I'm rich and increased with goods and have need of nothing. Well, that's kind of what the description was here of this land that was conquered by Dan. Listen to it again. Where there is no want of anything that is in the earth. Sounds just like Laodicea. And another interesting aspect too is if you go back and look at the original land allotment that Dan ended up actually rejecting, one of the cities, verse 44, Eltekeh, Elteka, I'm guessing. I've seen different translations for what that means, and 2 of the translations involve vomiting out. Remember what it says about Laodicea? Vomiting out. So I found that very, very interesting. So we've got a group of people who conquered a large land of plenty, one physically, one spiritually and doctrinally. This place was inhabited by immigrants. Old Testament Dan set up a false religion in the land that they physically conquered. Well, New Testament Dan has as well. And so what I want to look at now is some things about, let's go to Genesis 49. Let's do that first. I skipped over one of the most important verses. Genesis 49. The horse and the rider. Now, if you've made it this far in the video, you already know I'm talking about dispensationalism. Dispensationalism is the modern New Testament tribe of Dan. And this is one of those things that I've been studying for over a year now. And I started out, and God shows you things, and it's like, I don't want to believe this. Because this is terrifying implications when you look at the millions and millions of people who follow this system. But every time I wanted to doubt it, he piled more and more evidence up. And so let's look at that evidence. Genesis 49, and Jacob called unto his sons and said, gather yourselves together that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. And boy, let me tell you, did he mean last days. Skip to verse 17, or verse 16 first. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. That was clearly in the Old Testament. But verse 17, this almost seems like a two-part prophecy, right? That's the way I take it. I'm not telling you you have to agree with me on that. Verse 17, Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path that biteth the horse's heels, so that his rider shall fall backward. There's a fellow by the man by the name of John Nelson Darby. Now, people that follow dispensationalism, they'll argue with you and say, he didn't start it. He did, because we're dealing with a tribe here. That's what I want to drive this point home. I'm not denying that there may have been an obscure guy here and there throughout church history, over here that thought some of this stuff that dispensationalism teaches. I'm not denying that. I'm sure it was possible. Law of averages probably dictates it was. What I'm talking about is a tribe. You've never had millions and millions of people who believe the lies of dispensationalism until what? Until after Darby and then the Scofield Bible. You can't argue with that. That's a fact. There was never a tribe that bought into all this stuff before that. So yes, he birthed the tribe. You say, well, what are you talking about? The rider falls off the horse, right? Dan is a serpent, by the way, causes the rider to fall. John Nelson Darby fell from a horse in 1827, and he was seriously injured. And during that time is when he developed his Danite doctrine that separates the church in Israel. It has the church reject its allotment in Israel, which is what Old Testament Dan did with the land they were allotted. Now, if you look at the fact that this is another little interesting nugget I found out. When he fell off the horse, he crushed his leg on a doorpost. Now, remember what John chapter 10, verse 9 said. Jesus is the door, right? So that's some really cool symbolism there when you think about it. But here's the other aspect of that. Darby fell off a horse, crushed his leg on a doorpost. He was a false prophet. Well, Balaam in Numbers chapter 22, pay attention to the 22 because it's coming back around. Numbers 22, Balaam was riding a donkey, crushed his foot against a wall. Okay, Darby fell off the horse, crushed his leg against the doorpost. He gained notoriety as a prophecy expert by giving speeches from Geneva, Switzerland, whose area code is 22. So there's that aspect of it. But I also want to go to Deuteronomy 33, verse 22. And of Dan, he said, Dan is a lion's whelp. 1 Peter 5:8, Satan is likened to a lion, by the way. And a whelp is a cub. Dan is a lion's whelp. He shall leap from Bashan. Shall there in that verse is word number 611 of that chapter. 33, verse 22. It comes out to 666. But anyways, Dan is a lion's whelp. He shall leap from Bashan. John Nelson Darby's family estate was called Leap Castle. Bashan was known for oak trees. So was the United Kingdom, which at the time Ireland, which is where he was actually from, that's where that castle was. Ireland was part of that. They hadn't got independence yet. Another aspect of this, the story in Judges 18. Judges 18. Back to that. The conquest that Dan, when he conquered Laish, that large land of plenty, the words 600 appear 3 different times in this chapter. Verse 11 is the first time you see it. And there went from thence of the family of the Danites out of Zor and out of Eshtal 600 men appointed with weapons of war. You see that 600 2 more times in this chapter. You see it in verse 16. You see it in verse 17. 600 plus 600 plus 600 is 1800, which is the year that John Nelson Darby was born. John Nelson Darby and some of his followers actually broke away from the Plymouth Brethren. They formed a group called the Exclusive Brethren. Well, in Revelation chapter 7, Dan is the excluded brethren who have no inheritance. Inheritance being salvation. Hebrews 1 verse 14. We're heirs of salvation. So there's all kinds of just hair-raising, if I had much, hair-raising connections here between this that just really drive the point home. You know, the large land of plenty with the immigrants, the horse and the rider. It all just matches up, just unbelievable, y'all. Well, believable, but just it's mind-blowing, I guess is what I should say. But what does this mean? Who is Dan and why are they missing? Well, they're missing. And I actually look at this as a twofold thing. I actually look at this as, if you think about what dispensationalism does to the text, you can't teach dispensationalism without doing what? As soon as you come into it, it's, well, you know, the church is gone after the 3rd chapter in Revelation. So they take the rest of the book of Revelation for the most part and just say it's not written to us. Well, Revelation 22 verse 19 tells us that whoever takes away from the book, their part's taken out of the book of life. And now that doesn't even take into account the fact that what they do with Matthew 24. They don't apply that to themselves. They don't apply Mark 13 to themselves by default because Mark 13 is the same conversation as Matthew 24. So they just say, well, that's just to some future group of Jews or some future group of people. They're doing exactly what Revelation 22 verse 19 says not to do. So right out of the gate, that is like low-hanging fruit as far as like, well, why would Dan be missing if Dan is dispensationalism? Bam. But I'm going to tell you what, I think there's actually a second part to this. The more I've looked at it. Okay, the doctrine of Dan has been going on since, well, Darby birthed it. The system, the tribe. Again, I'm not talking about obscure individuals throughout history that may or may not have held certain tenets of it. I'm talking about the tribe, y'all. Millions of people. Birthed at Darby. But ultimately, there's going to come a time when it's actually go time, as in the Lord's coming back. And there's something called the mark of the beast, right? Now, you'll get people arguing about what that's about. I've studied this in the book. I'm not saying I'm 100% right on everything, but I've seen too much in Scripture for me to say that it's just all spiritual. I truly believe, based on what I've seen in the book, that it's monetary based. It's going to be tied to finances. And so I want you to think about this. Judas betrayed Jesus over 30 pieces of silver, right? Dan was first born in Genesis 30, right? Okay, Judas was called a thief in John chapter 12. Dan stole from Micah. Even though it was false gods, they still stole. Judas had his place among the 12 disciples yanked, and he was replaced. Dan, his place among the 12 tribes, yanked. He's replaced. He's replaced by Manasseh. I'm going to get into that in a second. Why did Judas betray? Money. What is the mark tied to? What's going to happen when people who were promised an early escape and it don't show up, but the mark shows up? You can look at Matthew 24, verse 48 to 51 to find out what's going to happen. That's the evil servant. He expects the Lord to return earlier than he has ordained. And when it don't happen, he turns on his fellow servants and starts beating them and starts eating and drinking with sinners. You can look at that also through the lens of the seeds on the rocks. They're not tempering their joy with the realization that they're going to face tribulation and persecution. So when it comes, they become offended, they fall away, they betray. So it's all pointing to, it's a perfect storm for these folks. So I see it as at the culmination of it, I see definitely the mark being part of it. But ultimately, the doctrine itself, what it does to the text, it's dangerous, folks. And I want to go back to that because this is another interesting little connection here. Dan is replaced in Revelation 7 by Manasseh. Manasseh is the son of Joseph. If you go back to Genesis 30, verses 23 and 24, Joseph is tied to adding and taking away. And I'll read those verses right quick. And she conceived and bare a son and said, God hath taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. So he's tied to adding and taking away. So Joseph's son Manasseh is added and Dan is taken away. Why? Well, think about what Dan or dispensationalism does to the text. They add a non-existent, a biblically non-existent second resurrection of the righteous in order to make their pre-trib resurrection rapture work. Because otherwise, if you go by what the book says, there's only one resurrection of the righteous and the rapture coincides with it. And it's at the last day. It's not before the tribulation. But in order to make their doctrine work, they just forced a situation where there's a second resurrection of the righteous. And it comes somehow before the first one that's at the last day, but they just call it the rapture to get away with it. So they add to the text that way. And I've already told you what they take away. They take away over 80% of Revelation. They take away Matthew 24. They take away Mark 13. So, and it's kind of odd because when you think about it, it's like it's two layered, but it really feeds each other as far as the reason that they're not there, because by manipulating the text, they're setting themselves up for the fall where the people who are alive at the time of the mark, that's what's going to lead them to take it. You see what I'm saying? So it's really wild when you look into it, but I think that's pretty much it. I think I've covered everything. There are some other little minor details about the land allotments. You know, there's one back in Joshua 19 where one of the cities that Dan was allotted was called Bene Barak, which means sons of lightning. And, you know, Jesus said he beheld Satan fall like lightning. Just little details like that. But if you have no inheritance among the 12 tribes of Israel, you're toast. Like I've seen these people come up with these theories about, well, Dan's not there, but they're not law. No, the Israel of God is the new creature in Christ. Circumcision and uncircumcision, which is Jew, Gentile, ethnicity, it's irrelevant. Galatians 6, verse 15 and 16 tell us, well, you know what? Let's go there and read that right quick. I don't want to just spitball this. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision, that's Jew, availeth anything, it don't matter, nor uncircumcision, it don't matter, but a new creature. And as many as walk according to this rule. What rule? The new creature in Christ. That's what he just told you. Peace be on them and mercy and upon the Israel of God. If you're not in that number, and no, it's not a literal number. 144,000, that's not a literal number, it's symbolic. 24 is the number of God's priesthood. If you go back to 1 Chronicles 24, verse 1 through 18, there were 24 courses of priests in the Old Testament. It was patterned after the things in heaven. 24 is the number of the priesthood. 6,000 years of human history, if you multiply those two together, you get 144,000. God's priesthood over all of human history. Dan's not there. If you're not in that number, you're toast.